Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to cut the lapped dovetail joint. Looks quite difficult to start with, but with a little bit of care, a little bit of finesse, you will be laughing. So, let's go. Right, so there's a lot of instances that you could use a lapped dovetail, but the main one that you'd see it used in pretty much all furniture making is on the side of a drawer, where you want the mechanical strength of the dovetail so the components can't rip themselves apart, but you don't want the tails showing through on the front of the drawer. So you recess them halfway in and then you get the mechanical strength, and you also don't disrupt the front grain of the drawer. So before I go ahead with this, if you haven't already, I did a video on how to cut a through dovetail joint. So I'd probably watch that first, because a lap dovetail is kind of a progression on from that. It's a similar process, but it might help you out. So anyway, let's get in close and find out what tools we need for this. Right, so the tools you need for this joint are a marking knife, a couple of marking gauges, you need a square, you need a few chisels, you need a Jesus pen, of course, you need a mallet, you need a saw, and you need a coping saw or fret saw, something like that. And to mark the angles of the dovetails themselves, you've got a few options. You could use a dovetail marker, you could use a sliding bevel, or you could just use a dovetail guide, such as the Katz-Moses one I have here. And to mark the spacing between the tails, you could either use a simple ruler or you could use a compass. And furthermore, if you want to be a little bit of a barbarian, you could use a drill to drill out the waste, and I'll show you how to do that later. So let's get marking it out. Right, let's get all the rubbish out of the way first. Right, so firstly, let's mark our face sides and face edges of these joints, and I need that pen back. Right, so these components are not the same height. So if this were a drawer, perhaps the bottom of it would be flush and then you'd have a step on the top here or something like that. You see this design on a few dressers and things like that, where the drawer would be assembled like that and then the top of the table would be flush with the top of the drawer. Makes quite a nice design detail. Similarly, you can have it with the sides flush with the top of the drawer like that, and then people would cut finger pulls on the underside here so you can get your finger underneath it and pull the drawer out. We're not actually going to be cutting a drawer today, obviously, because that's something I'm going to do in a future video, but for now let's just mark our face sides and face edges. So the prettiest bit of this walnut is probably this nice streaky face, so I'll make that the face side, and then the face edge can be down here. And then on this one, let's see, yeah, that's probably the prettiest side, so that side would be out, that side can be down. It's run out again, I can't. Oh dear. Right, next pen. There you go, the Buddha pen, let's use that instead. So face edge on there. Right, face sides and face edges. So now when we assemble these joints, we've got the face side on here, face edges on the bottom, face side on here, face edge on the bottom. So they will always be assembled like that, with the face sides out and the face edges on the bottom. You can't accidentally assemble this joint in different ways, because that's not going to correspond to your face side and face edge mark. So next we're going to set the marking gauge to work out how far we want this ash to be nested into the walnut here. So this is one of the instances where I find the graduations on the side of the Veritas marking gauge to be useful, because if I'm working to a working drawing or something like that, I can simply take that measurement of, say, I don't know, 16 mil, and then set that on the marking edge here without having to get a ruler or anything like that on here. Makes it nice and easy. I did a tool duel between the Veritas marking gauge and the Type Mark marking gauge, if you haven't seen that, so I'll put the link in the top corner here. So I'll set this to 18 millimeters, and what I'm going to do is score around the edge of the ash on all four sides to get a nice shoulder line for the tails. So what I'll do on these is I'll make a nice heavy cut on the inside of the joint, and then on the outside where this face edge is, I'll just do a light cut on there, because not everyone likes the sight of marking gauge lines on the finished dovetail. So if we make it nice and light, it can easily be removed later on. And also do the edges as well. So I can make these nice and heavy because they're going to be chopped off. Okay, so that is marked around on all four sides, and now on the walnut here, because that's the face side, I'm going to come in from the back here, and I'm going to score up along the end grain like that. So again, I'm going to do light pressure here. It doesn't need to be anything too heavy. Just make it nice and crisp on there so I can easily see it. And now that offset is exactly the same as this. So then when it goes together, you've got a little bit of material left over, and you're not going to see the end grain of the ash through the front of the drawer. So next, we're going to mark out how far down we want this ash to be nested into the walnut. So assuming I was doing other dovetail joints, say I wanted to lap the other side of this, I would leave that marking gauge set as it is. This is why you have two marking gauges. So in the case of drawer making, the thickness that we set this marking gauge to is quite important. Normally I would just say set it to exactly the same width as that ash, and then score it along here so that when the joint goes together, it's pretty flush. The problem is, if you're doing drawers, for example, if you make this fit perfectly into a cavity, If you then assemble the joint and you need to flush down that end grain afterwards, it's going to mean that you're going to actually make that drawer too small for the cavity. So what I tend to do here in the case of drawer making is actually leave the ash on the end slightly overhanging. So then I can pretty much leave the end grain as it is. It's only the sides of the drawer that I need to plane down. This is by the most minuscule amount. It's not like a millimeter or anything like that. It is just a tiny hair over. This will be a little bit easier to see later on, but I will show you up close how I'm going to set this. Right, so press the marking gauge against the edge like that, and literally I'm just going to get it so I can just catch a tiny edge on there with my fingertips, and that is pretty much it. If I lock down this bottom one, I've got a small micro adjust on here that I can use. So there you go, it looks flush, but I can just about catch my finger on the edge of it, which means it's going to be slightly proud of it when we assemble it. So there we go, now that marking gauge is set to just under the thickness of the ash, I can transfer that to the walnut here. And I'm going to do light pressure to start with, don't try and dig it in here, and then just gradually increase it as we go. And that's pretty much all we've got to do with the marking gauges. So now we can mark out the spacing of the tails on the ash here. Right, so I said at the start of the video, to lay out the tails on the top here, you could either use a little ruler or you could use a compass. For this video, I'm just going to use a ruler because there's only going to be 2 tails on here. If I'm doing something with 3 tails and above, that is where I would use a compass to lay it out because it's a lot quicker. So if you want to know how to use a compass to lay out the tails, then watch the previous video I did on dovetailing and you'll see in there. So for this, I am just going to mark in 6mm from either end, mark the halfway point, and then just offset that 3mm either side of that. And there we go. Then I could get a dovetail marker on here like this, and I can score the end grain and the dovetail pitch at exactly the same time. So going up from the shoulder line like that, and there you go. The other option here is to use a square and square across all of the end grain to start with, and then set the sliding bevel to the angle of the dovetails you want. Again, I showed that in the previous video, but if you want to know more about dovetail ratios, then I did a video on that as well, which you can watch in the top corner here. Okay, and with that done, obviously mark your waist. You don't want to be cutting out the wrong areas here. Right, then to cut out this tail, just put your thumb up against the edge of the saw to use it as some sort of lateral guidance, and then just take out that back corner first, and then with long strokes take it down to the baseline. These are all techniques that I showed in a video on how to saw correctly, so if you're really struggling with this, then you can watch that as well. The link for that is in this top corner as well. The other option you have here is using a dovetail guide. This one here is by Katz-Moses, which is a really good guide. I did a review of this in the past, comparing it to the David Barron guide, and I also used this in the previous dovetailing video as well. Basically, it's got magnets on the side. They hold your saw at the correct angle, which is 1 in 6 in this case, and then it guides it down the cut. Really nice and easy to use. I absolutely love this guide. Cool, right, so that's all the tails cut out, and now we can just cut these ends off. So the other nice thing about this guide is that it has a 90-degree face on it as well. So I don't tend to saw straight in that shoulder line. I prefer to leave about 1mm of material. So I'll put that shoulder face directly on the line and then move it up about 1mm, put the saw on there. And then remove that material. This is a little bit cleaner if you have a dedicated crosscut saw, but if you just use a standard dovetail saw like this, that will also work. So I'll nibble away the back and then lower the saw down. You can try and ping it off if you want. Woohoo, that one went. Let's get rid of that. Right, and then this can be one of the trickier bits to get rid of. If I hit that through, it's going to push the chisel back like this, and it's going to dent below the shoulder line, and we'll get a manky gap there. So about 1mm of material, I'm going to take half of that off to start with. So you see I'm holding the chisel very low here. I'm not holding it up by the handle or anything because you don't really get a feel for it. So half the material, and then I'm just going to sort of follow it down that shoulder line. There we go, so that's most of it removed, and now, because there's such a minuscule amount of material on there, it's not going to wedge that chisel back. So that can go directly in the shoulder line. Take a lot of care when doing this. Just do tiny taps. Right, so there, that didn't quite follow all the way down. You can see I've got a tiny bit of shoulder line there left, which isn't too much of an issue. It means that I can just put it upright. Then I'm going to find that shoulder line with my chisel. Then I'm angling the chisel down here so that it's going to be cutting upwards. I'm going to put a small peak in that shoulder line, just like that. And then on the other side as well, chances are that's a little bit high. I'll just get rid of that little bit of fluff in the corner because that's causing a little bit of difficulty. Right, now I've swapped it back around the other way, and where we've come up with the chisel here and then flat in from the side, it means I'm going to have a small bump sort of around this area here. So I'm just going to remove that with a chisel, being very careful. What I don't want to do here is hit the shoulder line on the outside, because that's obviously spot on. And what you can probably see on the camera is the little white line around all the edges, and that is the original marking gauge line that we've split in half. So if that white line disappears, that means that you have gone through the marking gauge line. You can see by doing it this method, there's a lot more chances for it to go wrong and accidentally dig too deep. That's why I tend to try and just get it spot on, going straight down from the edge here. That'll do. Right, let's try and do the other one a little bit better. Right, we'll remove half the material to start with. Now I'll put the chisel into that line. There we go, that's what we wanted. So get rid of all the fluff in the corner here. Right, so now to remove the material in the middle, so we'll get the fret saw in there, get it close to the bottom, and saw as close to that line as possible. A little bit out there as well. Cool. Right, now we can chisel down into this baseline. Right, so now to clean out the waste between here, what I'm doing is standing with my vision along the shoulder line, so when I put my chisel in there, I can see if it's tilting forwards or backwards. If I'm looking at it from this way, you can't really see that angle very easily. So stand looking along the shoulder line, and there's about 1 millimeter of material again, so let's take away half of that. So instead of whacking this all the way through, what I'm going to do is hit it to halfway, flip it over, and then work from the other side. So here, 90 degrees, straight down to halfway. Okay, then it looks like I could actually halve that material again, so I'm probably going to do that as well. So halfway again. Okay, now the chisel is in the shoulder line, so I'm going to hit this for 2 taps at 90 degrees. Go down a tiny bit, and then I'm going to angle it out slightly and produce an undercut. So in that way we reduce the risk of any peaks between the dovetails, which are going to stop the joint from assembling properly. So putting a small undercut there will prevent that. Just don't go too haywire with it and do a massive angle on it. At the end of the day, an undercut is an undercut. You've only got to do a small amount. So hit that through to halfway. So then we've just got some little hairy bits left in the corner here. So I'm going to put the chisel and reference it against the side of the tail, and then just roll it up towards that baseline. The same on here. Reference it against the tail and then just roll it up. And then with those bits, we can get the chisel in there and probably just pair them out. There we go. So that's all done this side. Now we can flip it over and do the same on the other. So you might be able to see here that I haven't quite cut down to the shoulder line with the saw. So again, I'm just going to put the chisel in there, reference it against the side of the tail and just roll it up ever so slightly. Reference it against that tail and roll it up to hit that shoulder line. And now you can see it close up. Remove half that material, and we're only aiming for halfway here, obviously. So there we go. That's where it's cracked through to the previous side now. And then I can halve that material again because it looks a little bit skew whiff at the moment, so I might as well make it nice and even. The last little bit, chisel into that line, a couple of taps at 90, and then small undercut. And there you go, that's all good. And chances are that's going to leave you with some little bits in the corners as well, so you can just pair those out with a very, very sharp chisel. Just be sure not to push it too hard and punch out the end grain on the opposite side. The other thing you could use here is a little knife as well, just to get into the corners and score it out that way. Okay, so that's it all sawn out. All the shoulder lines are all chopped down and everything. It's pretty much ready to go. Now at this point, you can go and start tracing around this and nest it onto the pin board. But to make it a little bit easier to help you with location, what I tend to do here is put a little leading edge on the back of the shoulder line here. So this is why I scored the shoulder line on the back of the component a lot deeper with the marking gauge, because it's going to help with this. What I'm going to do is choke up on a chisel. Don't hold it by the handle for doing this, because you are just going to chop your hand off. Hold it right down the bottom here, and then about 2 millimeters maybe from the shoulder line, angle your chisel up, and then just wiggle it side to side until you hit the shoulder line. You're basically cutting a small V groove here, and you'll feel like a little click as it hits that shoulder line. So I'm going to do this all the way along. Now if it needs a little bit of cleanup, just put your chisel into the shoulder line and just give it a small tap with a hammer. Okay, so that's left us with a little leading edge on the back here, which is going to help us with the location on the pin board. which we're going to do now. Right, so nesting these together, clamp the pin board upright in the vise like this, and then get some sort of flat platform behind it. I'm just going to use the sliding bevel for this because it's going to work. And with the pin board, I'm going to leave that sitting proud of the sliding bevel by about 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters or so. And then what I can do is pop the tailboard onto the sliding bevel with the other end obviously resting on the pin board. And because the sliding bevel is lower than this, it means that it's going to engage on that little notch that we put on there. So the face edge of this top component is on this side and the face edge of the walnut is on this side as well. And because I want them to be flush, I can put a chisel on the bottom of the walnut like this and then rest that up against the tailboard and then slide that up against the chisel. And now I have 2 points of location. The advantage to this is if you accidentally slip with this top component, you can pretty much get it in exactly the same place again later on. But ideally you don't really want it to move at all. So that's the position I'm happy with it being in. So I'm going to hold it there, make sure it doesn't move. And then with a marking knife, I'm going to score around the tail. So I'm going to do very, very light pressure to start with and then increase it. There we go. And that has left us with the outline of our tails on there. And then I can square these tails down to the shoulder line that we scratched on at the start. So you can do this with a pen. You don't really need to do this with a knife. There we go, and obviously mark the waist. Right, so now all of that is marked out, we're ready to start hacking out the material. So to do this, what I tend to do is establish the sides first with a saw, but I don't go directly to that line. I like to chisel back to it later on. When you're sawing these out, a lot of people struggle with what angle to hold your saw. It's quite difficult to picture. Some people will put it straight on like that and then tilt the saw, but that's not going to give you the right angle. Then they'll try and follow the angle of the tail, but then still end up tilting the saw. Pretty much all you've got to do is put your saw on the top, match the angle of the tail and then tilt back. Do not tilt to the side or anything like that. It's simply matching the angle of that and then tilt back. So I'll do little nibbles at the front just to see how close I am to that line. And that's about 1 millimeter away, which is what I want. So then I'll follow that all the way up, being careful not to go beyond the line that I've scratched along the top here and the shoulder line on the bottom here that I scratched with the other marking gauge. Alright, there we go. So that's the edges done and they're about 1 millimeter away from the lines. I'm going to put one down the middle as well. There we go. So 3 lines there, weakened the material. Right, now I'm not going to lie, removing this material here is an absolute royal pain in the arse because you can't really saw it out with a coping saw, or you can, but you end up taking like this little spoon-shaped scoop out of it, so it's not really that effective. Similarly, if you keep chiseling in, you take out little right angles, that takes a long time. You blunt your chisels quite quickly and just generally not very enjoyable. The other method I've seen people use is like a little hand router or something like that. They balance it on the end grain and trim out most of the material, then clean it out with a chisel. My method is generally with a drill. It's a little bit barbaric, but it does the job. So I'm going to put the drill up against the side here to where it hits the shoulder line and then put a little bit of masking tape around it like that. And there you go, there's my super fancy depth stop. And then I'm just going to drill over at random points on the end grain and get rid of most of that material. Now with this method, just be careful because when the shavings start gathering up in the drill here, it can start pushing the masking tape up. So don't let it get too clogged in there. There you go, so that looked pretty barbaric, but this is even worse. Look, I come in from the front like this. There we go. So you see it's a little bit barbaric, but it does the job. It hacks out a lot of material. So now I can just go in there with a chisel and clean out most of that material. So while I'm doing this, I'm not going to actually go down to the shoulder lines or any of the knife lines that I've done around the top. I'm just getting rid of all of these horrible bits that have been left over by the drill. This is like the rough cleanup at this point. And then these little bits at the back, don't be taking off too much when you do this. So I'm still not going to those knife lines yet, it's still rough cleanup. Right, so I'm just sort of finalising the rough cleanup now. So what I'm aiming to do here is get about 1 millimeter from all of the knife lines and the shoulder line on the bottom. And what I do at this point is take my chisel away, go and sharpen it, and then trim back to the knife lines with a fresh edge on there. Right, there we go. So rough cleanup done. I'm going to go sharpen this chisel and we'll finalise those sockets. Right, so we all know how it goes now. About 1 millimetre away from the shoulder line, so I'm going to chop about half of that away. So hitting it vertical here until the tone of the chisel sounds, and then I know I've hit the bottom there, or I can just look. Okay, now chisel can go in that shoulder line. In fact, I'm going to get a wider chisel for this. So obviously the wider the chisel, the easier these jobs are. So these ones I am just hitting straight down vertical. I never really undercut these because when it comes to clamping them, it can start throwing them out and all that. So try and hit these down at 90 degrees. You can also get a square on the back edge of the chisel just to help you with that. And don't worry about the little bits left in the corners here because we can clean those out when I put this upright in a minute. Okay, let's put it upright. Right, and then with our sharp chisel, let's get rid of all of these bits in the corner first that we weren't able to get to with the wider ones. Okay, that's all the rubbish cleared out, so now we can start paring back to these knife lines. Now the way to do this, instead of going down on the end grain like that, you usually get a little bit more control going in from the front like this. So what I'm doing here is pulling the chisel into the wall with my hand like this, and then just carefully pushing it through. Okay, so I've hit it on the back there. I've got a little bit more work to do on the front. You see, I'm just rolling it in from that front corner. And there we go, that hit the line there. Okay, so that's all the lines established along the edges, and basically where I pull it in like that, there's a chance that the chisel might be rocking, so these inside walls might be sloped. Because the top is now established, we can go down vertically and sort of take out the bottoms of those just in case they are sloped inwards a bit. You can see that even with drilling out the waste, it's still an absolute nightmare to get rid of all this material in here. Right, so now for these back ones, I'm going to get it as close as possible with the chisel without committing to the final knife line. So I'm just going to pare away the material. Okay, and that looks to be pretty close. So now I can put the chisel straight into that line and do some very small taps to hit it vertical. You want to be really careful with this bit because if the end grain splits the wrong way, i.e. in the direction towards that back wall, it's going to make this material on top very, very weak. So take off a small amount as you can here. This side I did earlier, I just forgot to turn my camera on. Okay, so that's all sorted, and now I can just do a final bit of cleanup all in the corners just to make sure nothing in here is going to prevent the joint from bottoming out. So I tend to just do this with a knife, cut out any of the little fluffy bits that you may see in there. Right, moment of truth. Oh, okay, that is going to go in by the looks of it. There we go. So those tails are sitting ever so slightly proud. Sort of see I'm catching my fingernail on the edge of them. Happy days. That looks really nice. Right, so I got all this glued together last night, and sometimes if it's a tight fit, you don't even need clamps. So this was one of those cases. I just hammered it in with a bit of glue and voila, that was ready to go. So as you can see, the tails are sitting ever so slightly proud of the walnut. So if this was a drawer, that would be ideal because then we can just plane down the sides to fit into a cavity. But yeah, let's see how it turns out. Okay, so I'm pretty much just finishing down the ash now, and it's just starting to hit the walnut now. So it's just going to take some little skins all over. And there we go, we're not having to hack too much off the walnut there, just a few little shavings and all of that is flush. It looks pretty good. Right, and there you go guys, that is how you cut a lapped dovetail joint. So as you can see, it's not that tricky. The reason being, a lot of the joint is actually hidden internally there. It's only visible on one side, whereas through dovetail, it's visible on two sides as opposed to one. So you've got a little bit of leeway with this joint, but I would still advise you to watch the through dovetail tutorial I did in the past. Yeah. Best of luck with it. See you in the next video.